I don't know what you're talking about. I have a very bubbly personality. Isn't it obvious? Personality is your unique, long-term pattern of thinking, emotion, and behavior. You can think of personality as the consistency of who you were, who you are, and who you will be in the future. Now, in modern personality psychology, we tend to talk about personality as consisting of multiple traits. So a personality trait, that's just like a stable quality that you'll show in most situations. But exactly what those traits are, like how many traits there are and what they describe, that varies from theory to theory. But one of the first people to talk about differences in people's personalities was Carl Jung. You might recognize the name Carl Jung because he was one of Sigmund Freud's apprentices. And besides doing psychoanalysis, he also talked about personality types. So a personality type, that's just a kind of person who has several personality traits in common with others of the same type. And the two types that he talked about were introverts and extroverts. Now, an introvert is somebody who's more shy, reserved, and self-centered. They get their primary source of stimulation, their primary source of engagement would be focus on what's going on inside their own head. That's what introvert means, is they're like looking at, they're interested in their internal world. An extrovert, on the other hand, is going to be more bold and outgoing, and they're definitely going to seek their interests. They're going to seek arousal from the external world. So they'll interact with other people and like to leave the house once in a while. Now, two major aspects of our personality would include our self-concept and our self-esteem. So when I'm talking about self-concept, I'm just referring to just the way you understand your own personality, your ideas and perceptions and feelings about who you are, what kind of a person you are. And we form our own self-concepts by just, basically watching ourselves, by paying attention to the kinds of things we do, how we react to various kinds of, stimuli and events. So we definitely build our self-concepts out of our daily experiences and revise them as new information comes in. So as you grow and mature, you're constantly kind of revising your self-concept. And something that's definitely related to that, your self-concept, would be your self-esteem. And to put it simply, self-esteem, that's just referring to how you feel about yourself in terms of good and bad. So do you have a more positive, do you have a more pleasant evaluation of yourself, or do you have a more negative, unpleasant opinion of yourself? And you can have a high self-esteem in some areas of your personality, but low in others. But let's talk more about those different aspects of personality. Let's talk about those various traits I mentioned earlier. Like I said, modern personality psychology tends to think of personality as consisting of multiple kinds of stable qualities. So this is called the trait approach. And you can think of this trait approach as just, if you've ever played a role-playing game, it's like a character sheet, right? So just think of a role-playing game you've played. When you open up your character sheet, you'll see your character's name and level and things like that, but then you'll see all their different attributes, their traits. So you have things like strength and dexterity and endurance and things like that. Well, that's the basic idea of the trait approach, is that we all have something like a character sheet where each one of us has a certain set of traits, and we can be higher or lower on that trait. So just think of like your own character sheet where you have a bunch of numbers for each different kind of quality. And that's basically what we're talking about here. And modern trait theorists would argue that those, traits and the values that are associated with each one are like biological predispositions. They're something you inherit that makes you more likely to engage in certain kinds of behaviors. So this just all goes back to genetics again. Just because you have, this genetic predisposition, just because you have this biological predisposition, that's not a guarantee that you're going to act any particular way. It just makes it more likely. So one of the first trait theorists to, really popularize the idea was Gordon Allport. And he talked about traits, he talked about numerous traits, but he broke them down into three kinds. You have the cardinal traits, which dominate your behavior. Pretty much everything you ever do can be traced back to your cardinal traits. Then you have central traits, which are about 5 to 10 consistent, like core qualities of your personality. And then a whole long list of secondary traits, which are inconsistent, superficial. They explain a lot about your personality, but they don't. They change often. These are things like your preferences, your musical tastes, like the kinds of things you like to do. Stuff that most of us will change as we grow older. The next big trait theorist to come along was Raymond Cattell, and he took all of these different traits that were proposed earlier, and he just kind of broke them down into just 16. So we've reduced the number of traits to just 16 now. And he called these 16 traits the source traits. Here's a table showing all the different traits. So you have things like how outgoing you are, how intelligent you are, how emotionally stable you are, how dominant you are, how serious, conscientious, how adventuresome you are, how sensitive, suspicious, practical, shrewd, apprehensive, conservative, self-sufficient, controlled, and relaxed. So we would just rate you on a scale of like 1 to 8 on each one of these traits, and your series of ratings, like all those different ratings combined, that would form something called your trait profile. And what we would do then is we would just compare your trait profile to other people to see relatively how different are your personality. Later on, a researcher by the name of Eysenck was able to reduce the number of traits from 16 all the way down to just 3. So now we can talk about personality as being in terms of like a 3-dimensional model. So those 3 dimensions would be emotional stability, extroversion, and impulse control. So your personality on this model would just be like a single dot somewhere in this 3-dimensional space. But all these models, while they're interesting to talk about like from a historical perspective, they aren't very popular anymore. The most popular model nowadays, the modern way that we talk about personality in terms of different traits, would be the Big Five. Now the Big Five has a long history. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about it, but the whole idea here is that a bunch of personality psychologists just tried to understand all the different ways we talk about personality. They looked at all the different kinds of terms that we use to describe personality, and doing something called factor analysis, where they just kind of look for relationships between things, they were able to break down all those different terms to just 5 terms. Now they could have had more or less, but 5 is just, it seems like a good number, to put it simply. So the Big 5 personality traits are extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability or neuroticism, and finally intellect or openness to experience. So let's talk about each one of these. Extroversion I've already talked about, this degree to which you're more extroverted or introverted. Agreeableness, though, that's more so having to do with how friendly, nurturing, warm and caring you are. So if you're rated high in agreeableness, you're somebody like, Mr. Rogers, for example. People just feel comfortable when they're around you. Conscientiousness, that's the third trait. People who are high in conscientiousness are self-disciplined, responsible, and achieving. So if you rated high in conscientiousness, that just means that you have like a dedication to do your job, and you want to do a good job. Like you get good grades in school, not because you're a genius, but because you're willing to put in the effort and you take it very seriously. People who are rated high in conscientiousness oftentimes will do great things to help other people, even if they don't really get rewarded for doing so. Now the fourth of the big five would be neuroticism, or emotional stability. This just refers to the degree to which a person experiences more negative, upsetting kinds of emotions or more pleasant emotions. People who are rated high in neuroticism tend to be a bit more suspicious, a bit more neurotic. It's just everything seems like it's out to get them. Little things that most of us wouldn't worry about make a big deal to them, and they get very upset about it. They're pessimistic, to put it in another way. Now, just as an example, somebody who I would say is perhaps rated very high in neuroticism would be Trent Reznor. And if you're not familiar with the name, he's the guy behind 9 Inch Nails. And if you're not familiar with that, then I guess I'm really dating myself now. Now, the fifth of the big five traits would be openness to experience, or intellect. That's just the degree to which a person is more open to new experiences and willing to try new things and, question their previous assumptions and things like that. These individuals are just, somebody who's rated high in this, they're just much more likely to get into debates, and it's not the kind of debate where the person is going to just say their opinion over and over again. That's one where they're actually likely to change. So if you make a good case, somebody rated high on this would likely agree with you. They'd likely change their opinion to match yours because you were able to convince them. So these people are, the opposite of stubborn and ignorant. So if you would like to just see how you might be rated on the big five, you would of course have to go to a professional to get that kind of personality test done. But just for fun, if you just want to get a general sense of what your personality might look like, I've included a link to an online test in the comments. And I've also included a link to a video that goes into more detail about the big five, what it is and how it was developed.